I eat a lot of meat, and apparently, so does everyone else. Globally, we produce over 340 million tons of meat each year. That's almost 50% more than what we produced just 20 years ago, and production is expected to keep growing. By 2050, global meat consumption is projected to reach between 460 and 570 million tons. 570 million tons would mean meat consumption twice as high as it was in 2008. While this might be good news for the meat industry, it's not great news for everyone else. High meat production comes at a large cost, especially to our planet. As global populations rise and incomes increase, especially in developing countries, people tend to eat more meat. To keep up with this demand, livestock production has become highly industrialized. Small farms with free-roaming animals are disappearing, making way for large industrial meat factories. Today, 3/4 of the world's poultry, half of the pork, and 2/3 of the eggs come from these massive operations. And we all know what happens when you take a small farm and replace it with a large industrial factory. Pollution, a lot of it. Livestock production is responsible for 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions, including 9% of carbon dioxide and 37% of methane, which are major contributors to global warming. Additionally, over 2/3 of all agriculture land is used to grow feed for livestock, while only 8% is used to grow food directly for humans. This is extremely inefficient and unsustainable. Imagine if half the food in your fridge was used to feed your pet. That's similar to what's happening on a global scale. We're wasting a ton of land that could have been used to grow food to directly consume, just to meet our high meat demands. If everyone in the world ate as much meat as the average person in the West, we would need 2/3 more land than what we currently have. And the environmental impact doesn't stop there. The global livestock industry uses huge amounts of fresh water, destroys forests and grasslands, and causes soil erosion. Pollution from fertilizer and animal waste creates dead zones in coastal areas and smothers coral reefs. Understanding the true cost of meat production is complex. Take a piece of chicken, for example. You have to consider the land used to raise the chickens, the resources needed to grow the grain to feed them, and the resulting pollution. Often, the grain is grown in countries like Brazil, where rainforests are cleared to produce soybeans for animal feed. This trade has environmental impacts on both the producing and consuming countries. For example, Japan relies heavily on imported grain to support its meat industry. If Japan had to produce all its meats domestically, it would require 50% of its total arable land, which it simply doesn't have. This shows how the environmental burdens of meat production are often shifted abroad. In short, the environmental cost of meat production is huge. It drives deforestation, contributes significantly to global warming, and uses vast amounts of land and water. However, environmental impacts aren't the only concern. There are also significant ethical issues to consider. Our planet isn't the only one paying the price for our high meat consumption. The animals we eat also pay a massive price. When we talk about high meat production, it's impossible to ignore the mistreatment of animals that's embedded in the system. On industrial farms, there's only one goal in mind: make the most amount of product in the least amount of time. Animals aren't seen as living beings with needs and emotions. They're treated as mere commodities, valued solely for what they can produce, whether it's meat, milk, or eggs. And when this happens, it leads to widespread animal welfare issues. Take dairy cows, for instance. These animals are often confined to cramped, dirty spaces, forced to produce far more milk than their bodies were ever meant to. The relentless cycle of impregnation, birth, and separation from their calves is not just cruel, it's unnatural. Cows, like all mothers, form strong bonds with their calves, and being torn apart shortly after birth causes immense stress and suffering for both. This cycle continues until the cow's body is worn out and she's sent off to slaughter, often far earlier than her natural lifespan would allow. Take a look at this picture posted by The Ethical Consumer that shows the typical life of a dairy cow. It's heartbreaking to imagine the pain such an animal goes through just to meet our high meat demands. And of course, other animals suffer just as much. Chickens are often crammed into tiny cages where they can barely move, let alone engage in natural behaviors like foraging or dust bathing. Even in quote-unquote free-range systems, the reality is often far from the image of chickens roaming freely outdoors. Many free-range hens are kept in large, overcrowded sheds where access to the outside is limited and only a few birds ever make it out. In these sheds, the conditions can be just as grim as in traditional battery cages, with birds packed together so tightly that injuries and stress-related behaviors like feather pecking are common. I mean, take a look at this image posted by PETA that shows the average space a chicken on an industrial farm has. Even the quote-unquote organic chicken has barely any space to move around in. According to an analysis by the Sentience Institute, 99% of animals used for food in the US are living on factory farms. And every single one of them is put through immense amounts of pain and suffering before ultimately being slaughtered in non-humane ways. Industrial meat production is not a system just built off efficiency and profit. It's a system that fundamentally ignores the dignity and the well-being of animals involved. It reduces sentient beings to nothing more than production units, stripping them of their natural behaviors, their family bonds, and ultimately their lives. This is the hidden cost of cheap meat, and it's one that's paid entirely by the animals themselves. As Muslims, this should be a huge concern to us, but unfortunately, the vast majority of people are either unaware or don't really seem to care. If you look at the core tenets of Islam, you'll find that the purpose of our creation is to worship Allah, follow His guidance, and obey the Prophet, peace be upon him. But Islam also teaches us that we have another significant role, to be the guardians of the earth. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "The earth is green and beautiful, and Allah has appointed you His stewards over it." As Muslims, it's our duty and responsibility to ensure that we take good care of our planet so that our future generations can enjoy it just like we did. And unfortunately, the meat industry isn't really helping that cause. But it's not just pollution caused by the meat industry that should be of concern to us. There's also the animal welfare issues. If you look at the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, you'll see that the mistreatment of animals was highly disliked and discouraged by him. There's a famous story of the camel that was overworked by its owner. When the Prophet was made aware of this, he immediately rebuked the owner, saying, "Fear Allah in your treatment of these animals that cannot speak. Give them enough food and rest." And there's also the story of some Sahaba who took the eggs of a bird. The mother bird began to flutter around in distress. The Prophet, peace be upon him, asked, "Who has hurt the feelings of this bird by taking its eggs? Return them to her." This shows the level of empathy and care Islam advocates, even for the smallest of creatures. These are just some examples of how strict the Prophet, peace be upon him, was when it came to the mistreatment of animals. You don't have to be religious to recognize that the treatment of animals in industrial farms is deeply troubling. Anyone with a heart and a sense of morality can see that it's wrong. As Muslims, matter of fact, as humans, are we truly fulfilling our duty as guardians of the earth if we continue to support industries that harm our environment and mistreat our animals? So what exactly could we do to solve this widespread problem? Is there even a viable solution? The simplest solution would be to stop eating meat, but let's be real, no one, not even me, is willing to do that. Humans are biologically capable of eating meat, and it has played a significant role in our evolutionary history. Yes, we can live without meat, but why should we refrain from a blessing from God? And to be honest, becoming a vegan, and even becoming a vegetarian, is not easy. So the next closest solution would be to limit or reduce your meat consumption. This could mean swapping out some of our daily meals that contain meat with plant-based meals or alternatives. For example, if you eat meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, maybe replace one of those meals with a non-meat based meal. And if you eat meat 7 days a week, Maybe have 1 or even 2 days where you don't eat any meat-based meals. You can gradually continue to limit your meat consumption to whatever point you're comfortable with. And it isn't very hard in today's time. There are many plant-based meat alternatives that can help you transition to a lower meat diet. If we limit our meat consumption, the demand for meat will decrease, and as a result, so will the supply. If we eat less meat, then companies don't have any reason to produce so much. Remember how I mentioned earlier that small farms with free-roaming animals are disappearing, making way for large industrial meat factories? What if we lower the demand for meat? The opposite could happen. Those massive industrial meat factories might start to fade away, and small farms could begin to make a comeback. These farms generally produce less pollution and treat their animals much more humanely. Of course, this change could take years, maybe even decades, but it's a step in the right direction. Speaking of small farms, another solution to reducing your impact is to buy your meat from small, local farms. This can help support sustainable practices and humane treatment of animals. Yes, meat from small farms might be a bit more expensive, but you're paying for quality and ethical practices that large industrial farms often overlook. Plus, by supporting local farms, you're helping to keep these traditional farming practices alive and contributing to a healthier and more sustainable food system. The most important thing to remember is that any change, big or small, is significant. Even if you're the only one willing to make that change, it still matters. When you stand before God, you're accountable only for yourself. And who knows, you might have positive influence on others, inspiring them to join the cause as well. May Allah make it easy for us and ease our affairs. Ameen.